بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. أعزائي الدارسين بالفرقة الثالثة كلية تجارة جامعة القاهرة، مجموعة الدراسة باللغة الإنجليزية. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته، وأهلا ومرحبا بكم في هذا اللقاء الافتراضي الأول، والذي سوف أشرح لكم فيه الهدفين الأول والثاني من الباب الرابع، والذي موضوعه المحاسبة عن تكاليف الأوامر الإنتاجية. Chapter 4, Job Costing. Learning objective number 1. The building block concepts of costing systems. Hello dear students, this is my first virtual session in which I will explain learning objectives number 1 and number 2 of chapter 4, which is about job order costing. When developing the costing system which fits the firm, the management accountant must make a choice for each one of the following characteristics of costing methods. The first one is the cost accumulation method. That is, cost accumulation method is it a job costing or process costing or joint costing? You must choose one of these alternatives. The second choice is the cost measurement method. That means that is it actual or normal or standard costing? You must make your mind, you must decide. Thirdly, the cost accumulation method. Is it volume-based or activity-based? You must choose for each one of these three characteristics of costing methods. Each product costing system will reflect these three choices. For example, a company may choose to use job costing with normal costing and activity-based costing because that combination of choices best fits the firm's operations and strategic goals. Another firm might be better served by a product costing system based on process costs with standard cost and volume-based costing. The choice of a particular system depends on the nature of the industry and product or service, the firm's strategy and management information needs, and the costs and the benefits of acquiring, designing, modifying, and operating a particular system. As for the cost accumulation method, which must be decided upon, the management accountant must determine, is he going to adopt, use job or process costing method. Costs can be accumulated by tracing costs to a specific product or service, or by accumulating costs at the department level and then allocating these costs from the departments to the products or service. The first type is called job costing, and the latter type is called process costing. So we have two main costing systems. In a job costing system, each job may consist of individual product or batch of products or services. A job costing system is appropriate when most costs incurred for the job can be readily identified with a specific product, batch of product, customer order, contract, or project. Types of companies that use job costing method include those in construction, printing, special equipment manufacturing, shipbuilding, custom furniture manufacturing, professional services, medical services, advertising agencies, and others. Types of companies that use job costing include those as mentioned now. In contrast, process costing system is likely to be found in a firm that produces one or few homogeneous products or services. These firms often have continuous mass production. In this case, it is impractical to trace most costs to individual products. Industries where process costing is common include the chemical industries, bottling companies, plastics, food products, and paper products. Examples of companies using process costing systems include Shell Oil Company, Coca-Cola Company, this chapter number 4 which we are discussing now, is concerned with explaining job costing systems. As for process costing system, it will be explained in chapter number 17, inshallah. So before diving in the topic of this chapter, certain basic costing terminology should be clear to you. Three key points from the prior chapters illustrated in part 1 during last year. Let us take this down. Three key points from the prior chapters illustrated in part 1 during last year. The first was cost object. What do we mean by cost object? Cost object is anything for which a measurement of cost is desired. The second concept is direct costs of a cost object. I'll remind you, remember what we illustrated in last year about direct costs. Direct costs are costs that can be traced to that cost object in an economically feasible way. The third concept of the three which were illustrated last year is indirect costs. Indirect costs of a cost object are costs that cannot be traced to that cost object in an economically feasible way. In addition to these three concepts, which were illustrated last year, we have now two new terms. In addition to that, three ones. Cost pool. What do we mean by cost pool? Cost pool is a grouping of individual indirect cost items. And cost allocation base. What do we mean by cost allocation base? Cost allocation base is a systematic way to link an indirect cost or group of indirect costs to cost objects. The concepts represented by these five terms constitute the building blocks which we will use to design the costing systems described in this chapter. Cost allocation base. There are many ways to allocate indirect costs among different products, which are called cost objects. One way is based on the number of machine hours used to produce different products. This is only one way. Cost allocation base can be either financial, such as direct materials or labor costs, or non-financial, such as the number of labor hours or machine hours. The ideal allocation, cost allocation base, the ideal one is the cost driver of the indirect costs, because there is a cause and effect relationship between the cost allocation base and the indirect costs. When the cost object is a job, product, or customer, the cost allocation base is also called a cost application base. But when the cost object is a department or another cost pool, the cost allocation base is not called a cost application base. And if the cause and effect relationship is not clear-cut, if it is not clear-cut, indirect costs may be allocated based on revenues. Another criterion for allocating some indirect costs is the cost object's ability to bear the costs allocated to it. This introduction was about the learning objective number 1 of chapter 4, as I mentioned before. Now let us go to see learning objective number 2. Learning objective number 2, which is distinguishing job costing from process costing. We will illustrate now the main differences between these two costing systems. As illustrated in learning objective number 1 now, there are two main types of costing systems that can be used to assign costs to products or services. We have two basic types of costing systems. The first type is job costing system. This type of costing system is used when the cost object is a distinct product or service, which we call it a job. Each job generally uses different amounts of resources. Because the products and services are distinct and use different amounts of resources, job costing system is used to accumulate costs separately for each product or service. Yes. In order to determine the cost of any job order, we cannot divide the total manufacturing costs by the number of jobs, because, as I mentioned now, that each job uses different amounts of resources. The second type of costing systems is process costing system. This second type, which is process costing system, is the cost object in this case. The cost object is masses of identical or similar units of product or service. In this type of system, we divide the total cost of producing an identical or similar product by the total number of units produced to obtain a per unit cost. Many companies have costing systems that are neither pure job costing system nor pure process costing system, but have elements of both, tailored to the underlying operations. But in our text, we shall illustrate and discuss only the two main basic types of costing systems. And now we can, to make it easy, we can illustrate the differences between the two systems in the following exhibit. As I mentioned now, there are two main types of costing systems: job costing system and process costing system. Under job costing system, if we adopted this type of costing systems, this type is used when we have distinct units of a product or services. But to adopt process costing system, this is adopted when we have masses of identical or similar units of a product or service. So let us now transfer to see the following exhibit, which is illustrating the steps used under job costing system, the steps followed to determine the cost of each cost object. In order to measure costs using job order costing method, we have two steps through which we can measure costs using this type of costing system. The first step is to accumulate costs. You have first to accumulate the costs, manufacturing costs of the company. When you accumulate costs, manufacturing costs, you will find that these cost items is divided into three groups. The first group include the material things obtained and used in manufacturing. So this first group is called materials. This includes every material thing used in production. For example, this group, which is called materials, include raw materials, lubrication materials, oil for machines. All of these are examples of material things. The second group include money or sacrifices paid to workers in the plant or the factory. The second group is called labor. This include manufacturing workers' labors and supervisors' wages and administrators' salary. The third group will consist of any cost item which is not considered material or labor. So this is called others, other costs, other manufacturing costs elements. These include many other elements. For example, factory rent. Factory rent is not paid to obtain materials. And also, it is not paid to someone who works inside our factory. So this is others. Factory rent, electricity, lighting, conditioning, property tax, depreciation, transportation, and so on. After finishing the step number 1, we have now accumulated the manufacturing costs classified into 3 groups as you see. The second step is to assign these accumulated costs to the job orders where they were used. To assign these costs, so the second step, step number 2, is called cost assignment. In this step number 2, we take each cost element and we try to assign it to the job orders which were benefited from this cost item. Assuming that we produce only 2 types of cost objects. The first type is called cost object X, for example. The second will be called cost object Y. And now we want to assign these accumulated costs to these 2 job orders. As we mentioned, it is illogical to divide the total of these costs by 2, because as I mentioned now, each job order uses different amounts of costs. So we will try to assign each cost item to these 2 cost objects. When assigning these costs, we will find that costs are classified into 2 groups. The first group include those cost items which have relationship with certain cost object. We will find that some of these cost items is related to a certain job. So the first group will be assigned through tracing. The assignment here is called tracing. You trace the cost element to determine the amount of this cost element used in each job. For example, direct materials, raw materials. The raw materials, when issued from the storeroom to be used inside the factory, this material is issued upon materials requisition. In this document, it will be recorded that the amount of certain type of raw material is issued, certain amount is issued to be used in manufacturing cost object X or cost object Y. So through these documents, materials requisitions, through these documents, we can easily determine the amounts of raw materials issued and used in each job order. Also, as for the manufacturing workers' labors, each labor is working on a certain job order. So we can easily know the workers who worked in producing job order number X and those others who worked in manufacturing job order Y. So we will trace this item, cost item, and know how much of payroll was paid to those to be allocated to job order number X, and how much of the workers who worked in producing cost object Y. So as long as these costs are traceable, can be traced, so they are called direct costs. They will be assigned directly to their cost objects. We will assign these direct costs the amount which was used in producing Y will be assigned to this cost object in its production statement, and the other will be assigned directly here. But we have another cost items which are not traceable. We cannot trace these other cost items to determine exactly the amount used in each job. So the second group include non-traceable costs. Non-traceable costs, they will be called indirect costs. They do not have direct relationship with certain jobs. But we do not deny that production benefited and used these costs. So we wanted to assign these costs to those job orders, but we cannot determine precisely the amount of these costs used in each one. We cannot determine it directly. So these costs will be finally assigned, but through something called allocation. We do allocation. This indirect costs is allocated. Please attention. As for the direct costs are traced. So tracing is used in assigning direct costs only. But as for the indirect costs, we say allocating. Here we say tracing, but in the indirect costs, we say allocating. This will be allocated. How? How do we allocate these costs? This will be the subject of 2 chapters later on. This will be allocated. And at the end, now we can sum the costs assigned to each product, whether it is direct costs or indirect costs. This is an overview of the steps through which we can assign the accumulated costs to the job orders produced. These steps will be illustrated in detail in the following chapters. And now we came to the end of our first session, and I would like to thank all of you for attending and listening the virtual meeting.